Hi, everyone. We are waiting for Mr. Brinkley, so we expect him any minute, and we'll get going as soon as he gets here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on YouTube. Today we explore some of the most fascinating and important recordings of our time, the secret tapes made between 1971 and 1973 in the Oval Office during the Nixon presidency. Our guests this afternoon have given us a new comprehensive look into the world of Richard Nixon by listening to some 3,400 hours of conversations with the 37th president and his staff. The results help complete our picture of Richard Nixon, and I should say at the outset that there are about 2,600 hours of tapes containing conversations from February 1971 through July 1973 that are available to the public, and the Nixon Library is working hard to make more of these tapes available online. Before we move on to today's discussion, I want to tell you about several programs coming up later this month in the McGowan Theater. On Thursday, August 14th at 7 p.m., we'll show the film Pina about the modernist choreographer Pina Bausch, who died suddenly in 2009 during the filming of this documentary. On Tuesday, August 26th at 7, we'll observe the 94th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, with a panel discussion of how nearly a century of voting rights has impacted present-day political, social, and economic roles for women. This program will be presented in partnership with the Sewell Bennett House and Museum. If you want to know more about these and all of our upcoming programs, please refer to our monthly calendar of events, and there are sign-up sheets in the lobby. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are also application forms for membership in the lobby. And a little secret that I keep telling everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the Foundation for the National Archives. Our guest authors today, Douglas Brinkley and Luke Nichter, have just published a book, quite a book, that takes a new, fresh look at the recordings from the Nixon Oval Office. Midway through his first term, President Nixon approved a plan to install a White House taping system to chronicle important discussions. Known only to Nixon, Secret Service, and 3 aides, some 3,400 hours were captured and are housed at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. If you visit the Nixon Library and view the Watergate exhibit, you'll see an interactive panel with diagrams of the placement of microphones in the Oval Office and other office spaces for the Nixon administration, as well as his 5 predecessors. It's particularly fitting that Brinkley and Nichter grace our stage today, for as they cite in their acknowledgments, quote, "This book benefited greatly from the help of many helpful archivists, first at what was known as the Nixon Presidential Materials Project and then the Nixon Presidential Library," unquote. Singled out are many of the people who are in the room today, so thank you on behalf of the authors, but thank you also on behalf of the Archivist of the United States for the work that you have done to make these tapes available. Doug Brinkley is a professor of history and fellow at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston, the author of numerous books that have made the New York Times bestseller list and have won major prizes. Among his works, The Great Deluge, a book about Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He also edited The Reagan Diaries, which made #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Professor Brinkley has also written books on Walter Cronkite and President Roosevelt, both of them Kennedy and Carter. He's also a former director of the Eisenhower Center for American Studies at the University of New Orleans. Lou Nichter is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University, Central Texas, and a noted expert on the Nixon tapes. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Richard Nixon in Europe, The Reshaping of the Post-War Atlantic World. He's also written the book-length biographies of Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush. Our guest's new book, The Nixon Tapes, offers a selection of fascinating scenes, including the year Nixon opened relations with China, negotiated the SALT I arms agreement with the Soviet Union, and won a landslide re-election victory. Serving as moderator for today's program is Steve Roberts, who has been a journalist for 50 years and is now the Shapiro Professor of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, where he's taught for the last 23 years. His 25-year career with the New York Times included assignments as bureau chief in Los Angeles and Athens and as congressional and White House correspondent. He's also a senior writer at U.S. News for the past 7 years. His books include From Every End of This Earth, My Father's House, and with his wife, journalist Cokie Roberts, From This Day Forward. Brinkley, Nichter, and Roberts are all longtime friends and fans of the National Archives, so it's a personal pleasure to welcome them to the stage this afternoon.
Well, thank you, David, and delighted to see such a wonderful crowd. This is a massive book. It reminds me of a story when I first joined the New York Times. I had two colleagues named Hedrick Smith and Russell Baker. Hedrick Smith had written this massive tome called The Power Game in Washington, and Russell Baker had written a book of collection of his columns. And Rick said to Russell, "Great book, Russell. I couldn't put it down." And Russell looked at him and said, "Rick, I couldn't pick yours up." So you can use this as a workout tool, along with it's double duty here at the archives. We try to keep you healthy as well as informed. So this is, in fact, when they sign their books later, optional, you can get some handles for barbells to use it. It's a wonderful project and a fascinating subject, and of course in the news so much right now because it's the 40th anniversary this month of Richard Nixon's departure, which we all remember or at least have seen photos and videos of. So we will take I'll talk to some of these I'll talk to these gentlemen for a while, but then I'll leave plenty of time for your questions. So by all means, we have microphones here, and when we get to that, think of some things that you want answered, and we'll try to get to as many of you as possible. But both of you have spent so much time going over these tapes. And I'm going to start with a kind of an obvious question is, what did you learn that you didn't know before? What really came out to you that said, wow, I didn't know that before? Professor Nichter, you start.
Well, first, I want to thank the National Archives and the archivist, David Ferriero. And I also, working on the Nixon tapes, I want to say, for us, the real heroes are the archivists at the archives who spent far longer than we did working with these materials. And we have a few of these celebrities in the audience here. I know we have Maria Kristen, we have Fred Grabowski, we have Carrie McStay and some others that are here. And without you, this wouldn't be possible. But I think to get to your question, I think we learned a lot. I think one of the things that I learned the most about is, I didn't know this. Some people ask me, what makes a person want to listen to Richard Nixon for 10 years now? And of course, we still have 700 or 800 hours of tapes yet to be released, so we're going to continue to learn a lot of things about Richard Nixon. I think one of the things that struck me was, I didn't know this then, but we know it now, that so much attention is given, as it should be, to Watergate and abuses of government power that went on during the Nixon White House. And sometimes, though, you stop and think, Nixon didn't commit a crime every single day. He did take some days off. And, you look back and, all that material is about 200 some hours. It sounds like an awful lot, but it's about 5 to 7% of the tapes. 5 to 7% has created almost 100% today of our impression of Nixon, the man, and his presidency. So there's bound to be a time when we start to look at the other 95%. So I'm struck by how much new we have yet to learn. And we say, give Nixon credit where credit's due, and we can continue to criticize where we should.
What did you learn, Doug?
Well, again, echo David, thank you for having it. I always come to the National Archives when I can, and my 3 little kids, 7, 9, and 11, are running around right now, getting to see for their first time some of the founding documents perfectly curated here. I learned an awful lot. First off, for the size of this book could be piled a mile high. In fact, at one point we printed a bunch of it, and there's that much transcribed material we have. Luke and I try to focus on what matters for history, and particularly the Vietnam War, the opening to China, the Indo-Pakistani War, and another volume eventually will look at Watergate and some of what occurred in '73. So this volume's about '71 when the taping began in February, and '72 largely. The Nixon comes out of this book, I've been using a phrase, a diabolical pragmatist. In the sense that people want to keep saying in today's paradigm, are you on the right, are you on the left? Nixon, it doesn't really fit into one of those boxes. He was a Cold Warrior, wanted to win the Cold War like all the presidents of that era, but he would cut deals with people on Capitol Hill and listen to the public a lot. So on the liberal front, he surprises people. They created the Environmental Protection Agency, or Clean Air and Water, or was pro-affirmative action. In many ways, he's a continuation of the Great Society, nailing down a lot of Great Society. However, on the right side of the equation, he should have been an Eisenhower, who he served 8 years. He was Ike's VP, and Ike knew when he ran in '72, get out of Korea, that the American public doesn't have an appetite for wars of choice that go on in a terminal fashion. It destroyed Truman Korea to the point he couldn't run in '52. And Eisenhower said, I will go to Korea, meaning Mr. D-Day, Mr. Supreme Allied Commander in '52 said, I'll go to Korea, and he did. 6 months later, Eisenhower pulled us out of Korea. Nixon had that opportunity in '69 to blame the war, as he says on the tapes, blame it on Kennedy and Johnson. It's a democratic war. And his big mistake was choosing not to, because by staying there in Vietnam, the anti-war movement only grew and grew and grew, till it culminates with our current Secretary of State, John Kerry, testifying in front of the Fulbright Committee. How do you ask a man, to die for a mistake? And it led to things like Kent State and the massacre there and a protest. But and in the tapes, you see Nixon using all sorts of curse language and just saying, bomb the bejesus out of them. Bomb. We're going to bomb North Korea.
Bomb the bastards.
Bomb the bastards. I was trying to be G-rated for the archive audience.
This is the archives. We are accurate, historically accurate.
I said bastards yesterday, and I got chastised by my kids. Like, you said that. I was like, not me. Nixon said it. Anyway, the drama is, why didn't he get out of Vietnam sooner? Most people think that was a mistake. But involved with it is a triangular deal involving China and Russia, the Soviet Union. He felt by bombing a lot in the north, it showed the Chinese we were tough and that we wouldn't give in, and that he was a bit crazy, and that don't you dare mess with Taiwan or Hong Kong or Japan. And also, as you all know, assuredly, that Nixon was trying to drive a wedge between China and Russia. So his greatest success as president, I think, was the opening to China in '72. I think beyond the Watergate and obstruction of justice and all those things, his big mistake was not getting out of Vietnam sooner.
Well, picking up on that, Luke, Nixon sat, in addition to all of these tapes, he sat for a number of interviews, the famous Frost interviews, the Frank Gannon interviews, which have recently resurfaced. Having listened to all these tapes, if Richard Nixon were here sitting in my chair, what would you ask him? What is an unanswered question for you that if you had the chance to ask him, what would you do?
Well, it's a question that he's been asked so many times. Why didn't you burn the tapes? If it would have saved your presidency, and if the legal environment was very different then. In 2014, we forget that the president had much greater discretion over what was public, what was private, and ultimately it was the work of the archives that had to work through all the various issues, legal, climate, and restrictions. And, I can only guess how he would answer that. I think Nixon would say that he, because he was someone who for his whole life, Chuck Colson once told me that the reason why Nixon and I got along so well was because we were both from the same school of thought when it came to politics. He called it the Neum in the groin school of politics. Nixon was somebody who... Another
euphemism.
G-rated, sort of. And he was someone who needed a lifelong struggle, that without the struggle, he kind of wasn't himself. And I think what he would say was that he felt he took a gamble with history. I mean, he knew that more than anybody else how damaging the tapes would be to him when it came to Watergate, the cover-up, abuses of power. But I think Nixon ultimately thought, it could take 20 years, 50 years, here we are, 40 years, maybe 100 years, that his legacy in other areas might possibly, outlast Watergate and abuses of government power. I'm not sure whether that's true. He was called a square then. He's a square now. No single book or tape, I think, is going to turn him into kind of a warm, cuddly figure. He's Richard Nixon, after all. But I think that was the gamble with history that he thought he was taking.
Would you ask the same question? You have another one, Doug, that you would ask.
Well, I would have advised him to burn the tapes, and I hate to say that in an archive where we want to save everything, but it's just done terrible damage, the tapes, to Nixon, not just Watergate, but I think in history to the point that he can only rise so far because of the anti-Semitic slurs, the bigotry. We are in a I gotcha society, and it just takes one or two really nasty bits to turn people off. And people like Nelson Rockefeller thought he should burn them. Henry Kissinger thought he should burn them. But beyond that, once he saved them because he thought he was much more. I was surprised at what a historian Nixon was, how much he had read about world history, and how often he evokes historical figures or philosophers. Particularly in Vietnam, he's constantly talking about World War II and the Battle of the Bulge, and if they could fly airplanes at the Bulge snowstorm, they better get up there and go. What do you mean it's misty weather in North Vietnam? And the warring against his own Pentagon and defense establishment. Nixon's constantly beating up on the Pentagon as they don't have as being spineless. I don't know another president that's so hard on the Pentagon like Nixon was. He liked Winston Churchill a lot. Everybody admires Winston Churchill, so he's not unique. But Churchill wrote those histories of the Second World War. And I think Nixon thought once he left the presidency, he'd grab all these tapes, go to San Clemente, and at leisure with an assistant or two, be able to have all of this material to write multiple volumes of history, and maybe his 6-volume or 4-volume history of the Cold War. After all, he had been a major player since the 1940s. Yeah.
In addition to the question of why didn't you burn the tapes, is there anything else, if Nixon were sitting here, that you as a historian, you'd love to be able to get him to talk about? What else comes to mind?
Well, I would want to, I think a little bit more about Alger Hiss and why he started his career in California as a kind of red-baiting anti-communist. And the fact is now with the recent declassification and knowledge, it looks like Hiss was actually a spy. I mean, Nixon may have been onto something with some of that, but why he backed his whole career on that Hiss Chambers bit, and also how could he never start on being smarter on dealing with the press? I mean, to want to be in politics and destroy the press. I mean, a 10-year-old learns the saying, don't go after somebody with more ink than you and all of this. And here it just wants to destroy the New York Times, destroy CBS and NBC, hates all these liberal journalists, going to go get them. I do presidential history for a living. The good, successful presidents learn how to seduce the press. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt and FDR and John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan knew how to win over the press, even if the press were liberal or didn't agree with something, because they courted them the right way. Nixon, why wouldn't you ever court the press?
In fact, he almost, in one of the passages I read, he resents Kennedy for Kennedy's success at courting the press. So it wasn't as if he was unaware of the ability and the virtues of a president doing that.
I think so much has been written about Nixon's quote-unquote obsession with the Kennedys. What comes through it in the tapes when you have kind of a sufficient sample size of tapes that you listen to was, I think it's really just as much at times admiration as it is he detests the Kennedys. And privately you hear him in the tapes in the book. He kind of commiserates over kind of how effortlessly the Kennedys were successful at articulating and projecting the myth, as Nixon called it, of Camelot. But I think what Nixon failed to recognize in those conversations is that it was the structure of the Nixon White House and its policymaking itself based so much on secrecy. When so few people know about the initiatives, which truly were important, how can you expect that message to get out to the public if you're keeping executive branch agencies cut out of the loop of some of the policies? So there's a certain sort of dissonance, I think, about it just wasn't going to work. He wasn't ever going to have that image because no one knew enough about the things he was trying to do.
Well, you know, you talked about how he had a sense of history. You both have mentioned that, and that he perhaps might have wanted to use these tapes to write his, you know, Winston Churchill figured out that if you write your own history, you can write a pretty good version of it, you know.
Exactly.
But the other question that I've always had, in addition to why didn't you burn the tapes, is if you knew the tapes were there, the system was there, why did you say so many damaging things that could have been used against you? Which was, I mean, he was a lawyer. He understood in many ways that he was breaking the law. He knew the taping system was there, and yet he left all this incriminating evidence right there. What's your best take on that dimension?
He truly believed that the tapes belonged to him and that nobody would ever be able to take them away. And other people didn't know they were being recorded, and he did, which gave him a great advantage. I'm the only one in the room knowing this is being bugged. Even Camp David bugged. And
even Kissinger didn't know you.
Even Kissinger didn't know. I mean, it's humiliating to Kissinger, these tapes coming out. And you know, so he just thought, I'd be able to bring him back and I'd control him. There's a funny story I tell. The writer Hunter S. Thompson wrote a book called Fear and Loathing in the Campaign Trail, 72. But he has a little story later he wrote after that about the day Nixon finds out the Supreme Court voted unanimously to say that no, he doesn't own the tapes. And he had Nixon swimming in the beach in the ocean out there in San Clemente, and Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, up on a cliff saying, "The verdict's in, it's 8-0. And Nixon's like, "I told you we'd get the bastards." And Ziegler's, "No, 8-0. And as gonzo journalism, though, it's, you know, Halberstam used to say Hunter makes these things up, but sometimes they're more real than not. I mean, that's when Nixon really was shocked that this stuff's being stripped away from him.
I think I would also add, too, I mean, Richard Nixon never anticipated there would be a book like this one day. Some people have said, well, he must have choreographed some of these conversations because he knew he was being taped and nobody else did. I mean, that could have happened a few times. I think what's more likely, you see later in the tapes, there's even conversations later once you get into early 73, wherein he and Haldeman would say something like, you know, it would have been a really good idea had we gotten the executive office building bugged, my office there. And we did have that. That's been there all along. They seem to forget where the taping took place, where it didn't take place. And so you get a sense that once the system started running and the Secret Service was putting fresh reels on it in the morning and then changing them again in the afternoon if Nixon spent a lot of time in that particular taping location, that they did truly just forget about it.
You know, another thing that came through to me I'd like you to talk about. You mentioned Kennedy, you mentioned Reagan, two people known as natural politicians. Bill Clinton, a great natural politician. Richard Nixon, not a great natural politician, doesn't have the geniality and the common touch. And one of the things that one of the lines I was really struck was when he talks about the gray middle America as suckers. That's a heck of a thing for a president to say. What was your reaction to that? What do you think he meant by that?
I think what it shows is this is a president who's surrounded by many people throughout the book, and how many of them can you really say did he trust who were really his friends? You know, there are stories about even his close aides. Nixon didn't know the names of his children, their children. I think what it shows is that Nixon was surrounded by a lot of people who really didn't trust anybody, including the American people. It's an example of something you hear on the tapes that you think is obviously not very presidential. It's a terrible thing to hear. You put your headphones down and you kind of wish you didn't hear it sometimes. But these are the Nixon tapes, and they're unfiltered.
And also with that, he called the middle America the gray middle America a bunch of suckers, and he's talking about person-to-person diplomacy, like that the middle America loves hearing that Nixon's talking with Cho and Lai, that the American people believe if you're talking, it's somehow a good, positive thing. But Nixon was often a loner. He had very few friends. I mean, B.B. Rebozo was a friend. He had an excellent marriage, by all accounts, to Pat Nixon, who was his close friend. But he didn't, and remember, he called that gray middle America the silent majority of the American people that didn't like, feminism exploding in the streets and riots in urban centers, and they were law and order, that silent majority. But Nixon felt he knew those people and knew a lot of the American people weren't that smart. He was one of them. He grew up in rural California. This is not the California of Santa Barbara and Malibu. It's a desert, a Bakersfield, and cowboys, and arid West at an early part of the century. And his earthy language, the swearing that Nixon always does, that's the way a lot of men talked when he grew up. And he was sort of effete, was not a natural athlete, was sort of a nerd intellectual in a very macho milieu. So he learned to overcompensate by constantly being macho, over and over, the bastards, the SOBs, and so he didn't really feel that was anything wrong. He thought that's the way a man talks, and it's sad that he never evolved out of knowing you are the president, and this is a sacred place. And Bill Clinton faced some of that problem of not seeing the Oval Office as a sacred place that the American people want to believe in you.
How did a man with this personality, and I guess there are some assets to a politician being this driven, but how did a man who was not a natural politician, had very few friends, very few confidants, how did he get elected president twice?
I think it was just pure guts. I mean, he was never the favored candidate going back to his first House race in Southern California in 1946. He was a fighter. And you look at 46, you look at the 50 campaign for Senate, 52 with the Checkers speech, the 62 election race in California, where he gives the very unfiltered press conference. You don't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. He fought during the wilderness years. He fought in 68. I mean, one, we now know papers with difference, a margin with Hubert Humphrey. He fought again against McGovern, was involved in a scandal that he didn't even need in 1972 in order to win. He was just a fighter, and I think it was just, he had good instincts, and he put everything into his campaigns, even when he didn't win.
It was a blood sport for Nixon politics. He would destroy your opponent. He called it, knee in the groin. But he liked warriors. That fighter bit is what you're saying. It's just an unbelievable persistence, and it takes you a long ways in life sometimes.
One of the passages you guys talk about is when they reflect on his first term, and they're talking about a book that would be written about their first term, and he says, the word he comes back to in the tapes is guts. That's the word that he uses to describe what he thinks is his legacy.
Yeah, we found that. It's on the inside flap. And we found that portion about, a book should be written someday called 1972 pretty late in the book, the project. And I heard that one time and I thought, that in a way that's what we're doing. I mean, this book is supposed to be kind of before the fall. We all know what the Nixon Oval Office was like during Watergate. We've heard those conversations. When Nixon was under investigation, he's speaking from the defensive during the Oval Office. I think one of the things that we show in here is what was the Nixon White House like before he knew he was speaking for potential evidence to be used against him, before he was under attack and under investigation. You get a more look at what was an average day like before Watergate. So I think that's, we want to go on and work on a second volume and cover all the material we haven't done in this book, but it gives you kind of the two parts, kind of before and after the crisis.
And the other dimension that you both have implied, and this has been long said about Nixon, that while Watergate understandably and justifiably defines his historic legacy, there was a whole other dimension to his presidency, including the foreign policy. You've talked about Vietnam, but also the phrase Nixon to China has become part of our political lexicon. It stands for someone doing something bold, something out of character. You even today hear it referred to all the time as, in terms of, say, someone like Rand Paul coming out in favor of I just read it the other day. I was reading a passage about Rand Paul coming out in favor of reducing criminal sentences for certain kinds of drug laws and drug crimes. And this was a Nixon to China moment, something you would not expect from him. Talk about that phrase and its origins and what it means in terms of the Nixon presidency.
I think you're right. The Nixon to China is a phrase like the Kennedy moonshot. And can we do? Look, we're all looking for good foreign policy headlines, right? What are we getting today? Gaza and Israel ceasefire deteriorating, Iraq now a mess, Putin on the march. And wouldn't it be nice to get one good foreign policy news story on the front of the papers? And the China opening was that. I was amazed. Was a child, and I very well remember micro-following Nixon's trip to China in '72. But I'm surprised as what a fan Nixon becomes of China. He can't stand the Soviet Union. At one point in our book, he's talking about that they slobber all over celebrities in Russia, and they're doctrinaire, and you can never trust them, and they're not, basically you can't do a handshake agreement with Russia. Where Chinese live up to what they say they're going to do. And I thought you would see him negative about China, the repression or something, and he stays very positive. And the Chinese have intuited this because he's a folk hero in China. You mentioned Nixon, and Luke just went there following with all over. He could tell you about it. You go there, he's a folk hero in America. He's ranked at the rank bottom of American presidents, but he's not seen that way in other parts of the world.
I think I would add, too, I really thought that the tapes, if anything, would be the evidence that really definitively gives Nixon the credit for the opening to China. And actually, I came away thinking that he deserves a little less credit than we've given him. And I say that because certainly it wasn't a new idea. Others have talked about it. He had written about it himself in Foreign Affairs in 1967. What Nixon gets credit for is he was the first one who had the idea, embraced it, and took action on it. But I think what you see in the tapes in the book was that Nixon was not the only one who had both a brake and an accelerator on the opening to China. The Chinese clearly thought they were acting in their own interests. Sure. And you see in the Oval Office, Kissinger kind of reporting the play-by-play after the ping pong team had first been to Tokyo and then had gone to Beijing and had got an audience with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, that Kissinger comes into the Oval Office and says, Zhou Enlai has just received the ping pong team and has said to them that this begins a whole new era in relations with the United States. And Nixon says, to a ping pong team? They said that? Because, of course, Nixon and Kissinger thought they should be the ones controlling the gears in the opening to China.
Although that new book, it's Ping Pong Diplomacy, talks about how carefully the Chinese used the ping pong team. This was not accidental at all. It was very carefully.
Our book also deals with the panda bears in a very surreal moment. There's a lot of comedy and a dark comedy in this book. But when Nixon gets the pandas, decides he's going to put them here at the Washington Zoo when San Diego wanted them and others. And then he goes into a detailed description of the mating of the pandas and how they mate and what their climate is. And you hear all this on tape. It's a very bizarre thing from the president getting into animals' mating behavior.
And let me ask you one or two other questions, and we'll start taking questions from you in the audience in just a few minutes. So if you want to start, come to the microphones, please feel free. I'll turn to you in just a few minutes. But there are several new books out, right, on Nixon, and one by Ken Hughes argues that there's evidence that Nixon, through Anna Chennault, sent messages to the Vietnamese to prolong the war and not settle with the Democrats, partly for his own political reasons, and that this was, in the view of critics, morally reprehensible to prolong the war. What's your best take on that point? Do you think that's valid that he did that?
I think there is some validity to that. The best source for this, the Johnson Library in Austin, where we both live, has 3 folders of records on this, and they're not all released yet today. So I think we have more yet to learn. I think the facts are that the Nixon campaign, perhaps through John Mitchell, I think, did have contact with the South Vietnamese and Anna Chennault. We don't know whether Nixon was involved, whether Nixon choreographed that contact. There had been a long history of presidential candidates, even though meeting with opposition parties and meeting with opposition during wartime, during Korea. George McGovern met with the North Vietnamese during the 1972 campaign. So I think the question here is, did Nixon go beyond what he should have done? What was the custom in politics? And we don't have all the facts. Unfortunately, we don't have tapes for that period. And I think we are learning more, though. And when all the records come out, I think we'll finally know.
And connected to that, it's Ken Hughes' book, and Ken also runs with a bit of the tapes where he's dealing with the Brookings Institute, the break-in there, and using, I don't care, we have to resort to thievery, and it's very, very thuggish language by Nixon, and it shows perhaps a trend that will later, be part of the cover-up of Watergate, of a president willing to give that kind of order. It never happened, this Brookings Institute thing, I must say, but the language is there.
But there were other break-ins, including the break-in in Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in California.
This was a pattern of behavior. And as best as I can tell, Nixon didn't personally authorize the Watergate break-in, for example, but what he did authorize was the climate from which these other break-ins and criminal activity came from. I think that's clear. It goes back to, it's almost like he never stopped thinking in sort of campaign terms. I think when you're president, you can't do that stuff as president. And it's clear that Nixon permitted a climate of illegal activity that he endorsed. He wasn't always aware of the specifics.
And even encouraged.
He encouraged it.
That's a fair word, isn't it?
He did encourage it. I don't know that he knew specifically about the Ellsberg break-in, but I think that when John Ehrlichman authorized it, he would not have done so unless he thought the boss thought it was okay.
Okay, let me turn to some of our friends here in the audience. Start over here and we'll go back and forth.
I've
Please,
always
sir.
wondered, how did Fred Thompson and his staff know about the tapes, and how did they know to call Alexander Butterfield?
According to Thompson, and of course Thompson's papers are open for periods of his career other than this one, unfortunately. His Senate papers are open, his deputy's papers are open, and Howard Baker's papers are now open at the University of Tennessee. As far as we know, according to Thompson, he got a tip from the FBI that there might have been recording going on. But that, to me, that doesn't answer the question, because the person he says tipped him off wasn't aware of the taping system. So someone must have tipped that person off who tipped Fred Thompson off. There's also a rumor that it might have been Bob Woodward who tipped him off. I'm not sure how Bob Woodward might have known. But the official answer from Fred Thompson is that it was a source from the FBI.
But wasn't Butterfield the source?
I
But
think
you're saying that Thompson had to ask Butterfield the question.
exactly. How did Thompson know how to ask the question is what I interpreted your question to be. And then, Fred Thompson says he got the tip from the FBI, and then he asked the infamous question, Mr. Butterfield, were you aware of listening devices in the Oval Office? Yes, sir, I was aware.
And of course, deep throats the FBI with Mark Felt, as we now know, with all of that. So the FBI may be the source of where Thompson learned that.
Secondly, did I hear you say that 5 presidents before Nixon did tapes?
FDR did limited taping, and Kennedy did taping, and Johnson did quite a bit of taping, and all of them did after the World War II. But only Nixon did voice-activated taping, meaning everything you utter gets picked up. That's where he's getting nailed. It's different than knowing you're taping a phone conversation where you can be focused on that. This is picking up all the banter, all of the little bit of gossip, whatever's going on.
Yeah, Nixon taped more than all the rest combined. It's why, unfortunately, we couldn't make this book any smaller than it is.
You know, you mentioned Johnson. Of course, he taped a lot of telephone calls, and C-SPAN radio for years has, on Sunday afternoons, has had these calls. And my wife's dad, Hale Boggs, was then the majority whip of the House, and he had many conversations. And Cokie has had the experience of coming in to the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, turning on the radio, and hearing her father talking to the president, because it was her Sunday afternoon amusement for many years. Gentlemen, next.
What did you learn from the tapes about what Nixon thought about being vice president and his relationship with Eisenhower?
That's a good question. That material is almost completely unmined to date. There really hasn't been a book that's used that material. I can tell you there are many more big books along the way. For example, we just talked about the FBI. I know Beverly Gage is in the audience, and from Yale, writing a big book on J. Edgar Hoover. It's never been done in his whole life. I don't know how she's ever going to finish the book. It's such a big task. Irv Gelman is writing now about Nixon's period as vice presidency, and he's trying to use some of the tapes. It's just so hard when you listen to them because it's not when he talks about periods before the presidency, it kind of comes and goes, a few seconds, a minute here and there. You don't have like that really good conversation where he talks for 30 minutes about the vice presidency or about working in a House or the Senate. I think what the tapes do, to show, just quickly answer your question, what the tapes do show, I think, is a slightly warmer relationship between Nixon and Eisenhower than has been written about. The famous line about Eisenhower is, if you give me a minute, I'll try to think of...
He was asked
exactly,
to name a contribution.
to name one significant thing that Nixon had done as vice president, and he wasn't able to do that very quickly. And so I think that there is a lot of, we're talking about the other 95% of the tapes. So there's an incredible amount here that we still have to
There's some evidence that coming out vice presidential papers, I believe they're in Laguna Niguel out there, but the National Archives, there's some that Nixon was more involved with foreign policy making in the Eisenhower years than most scholars give him credit. They focus on Dulles, rightfully so, and the Dulles brothers and all of this, but Nixon was very engaged in foreign affairs throughout the Eisenhower years.
Did you want
How he wanted to be remembered, or why he wanted to be president. I mean, other than just to win the search, the battle, did he ever talk about what he wanted to do with the office?
I always say it would be wonderful if we had tapes for the entire presidency and not just 71 to 73. We probably could not only answer that question if we had tapes starting on January 20th, 1969, but we'd have a recording for the Nixon and Elvis meeting in December of 1970 on top of that. So I do wish we had those. Nixon doesn't really talk much about that. I just think it was, you look at Richard Nixon, and he was, you could argue, one of the most prepared politicians in the country's history to be president, having been one of the only ones to be House, Senate, 8 years of vice president under Eisenhower. I think in some ways it was a natural trajectory for his career, even though it got sidetracked in the 1960s with 1960, 1962. I think it was, I think he was a person, being a student of history, that he thought he was sort of destined to sort of reach the pinnacle, like so many historical figures that he'd read about and admired.
And he thought he was an expert on foreign affairs. He was going to go down as a great foreign affairs president. That's what he wanted. He saw people, particularly Kennedy and Johnson, as amateurs in that realm compared to himself because he was a micro student of the world at large. I truly believe he wanted to be seen as like a Churchill or de Gaulle-like figure, not Hubert Humphrey or a McGovern or Nelson Rockefeller. Statesman is what he was aiming for.
He also had the capacity to learn. I think that history, because of Watergate, has seen him as this thuggish, to use your word. But I recently was reviewing a book about the history of jokes and comics in politics. And people forget that Richard Nixon was the first American politician to go on a comedy show. It was called Laugh In, and it's well documented. This is the first time a president, he was a candidate, I guess, he's already president. But in 1967, he went on the Mike Douglas show, which was a chat show when he was rehabilitating his political image. And there's a quote in this new book by Robert Nichter where he says, "It's a shame that you have to go on TV and use gimmicks like this." And a young producer at the show named Roger Ailes says to him, "Mr. Nixon, TV is no gimmick. And if you think it is, you're going to lose again."
That's great.
And he had the capacity he hired Roger Ailes because he realized there was something he didn't know. So there was a real ability to learn there.
It's true. That's wonderful. And remember the laughing line? It used to be "sock it to me," and then he came on "sock it to me," and that became this very big.
Four words, but indelible part of
But
TV history.
I was stunned when I did my Walter Cronkite book to see in 1952, when we started having TV go gavel to gavel at conventions, Cronkite made extra money by doing a class on how to behave on TV if you're in politics, how to not look wrong. Nixon never took the class. But you know who did in 52? John F. Kennedy took Cronkite's class in 52. And then if you cut to 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon, people that listened on radio thought Nixon won substantively. People who watched on TV thought Kennedy. He never learned the art of television, and that was, as you said, it's real. If you're going to minimize it, you're going to get slaughtered. So he tries to go, but the sweaty lip that he has and the dark shadow, and he was never a very memorable public speaker, or in his press conference there was always kind of an artifice or something about him that he's not a great communicator.
To add one sentence, and I was going to say, so much has been written about Nixon's war on the press, and we talked about it a little bit today, but Nixon was also someone who really utilized and used the press. I mean, the Checkers speech was innovative and kept him in the race. Sometimes people ask me, is Nixon really as crude as it seems? Or is it just that he seems crude because he's the one who left us all these recordings? And is he the most crude, or were other presidents like that? Simply to leave us this volume of recordings and then sit for 30 hours of interviews with David Frost, another 30 hours with Frank Gannon, the video clips that are being released this week. We don't have this for any other president. So Nixon, he had this war on some parts of the press, but he also deeply tried to use the press to his advantage, too.
And look at the China in 72. He brought all the press corps with them, and they, it was a big press
at a time when
gaggle.
At a time when it could be both live here and live there when he was landing.
Sir.
Considering all those well-documented anti-Semitic nastiness comments of Nixon, how is it explainable that he associated so much with Jews throughout his career, and in one case, a former Jew? I mean, starting with Murray Chotiner, all the way down to Henry Kissinger and Arthur Burns and Leonard Garment and and James Schlesinger, all these
William
people he
Safire.
professed to despise.
I'll take it, then Luke can add to it. It rains anti-Semitism in the Nixon tapes, okay? And when we did First Serial and Vanity Fair, I purposely chose some to make sure people realized that how heinous that was. But I think his anti-Semitism was over what we call liberal Jews in America, that the Jewish media, Hollywood, and I could tell you he differentiated because he was very pro-Israel and thought Golda Meir was a hero and backed Israel in the Yom Kippur War in October of 73 when Egypt and Syria attacked them, because he thought those were kind of conservative or fighting Jewish people. So it was the liberals, and he would smear them with and make fun of them about being Jewish, even to Billy Graham. There's a conversation in our book of anti-Semitism between Billy Graham and Nixon. But and then it's really awful in the tapes when Kissinger comes in, and they're like saying nobody who's Jewish should be able to mediate in the Middle East, and Nixon uses clumsy terms like they were popped in a bake oven, and in World War II,
5 million popped
5
into a
billion
bake,
popped
into a bake
It's
oven.
just the language when he uses it. It really makes you cringe. A David Kennedy historian said it makes you want to take a shower when you read some of that material. And yet, as you well point out, he had all sorts of people that were Jewish working around him. I did a biography of Henry Ford, and who was deeply anti-Semitic. Yet he had Jewish friends too. It's just part of the game.
I think I would just add, too, it wasn't just Jewish people. Nixon, in a way, was sort of an equal opportunity hater of all types of people. I mean, he talks about Italians don't have their heads screwed on right. The Irish are drunks, and they get angry when they're drunk. The Latins aren't good at anything. They can't run government. Africans are 50 years from out of the trees, and they jumped up and down like a bunch of apes at the UN General Assembly. I mean, it's sort of, he has something like that to say for almost every ethnic group, every race out there. It's not just Jews, too.
Interesting point. Sir.
My question is, what were in the documents that Nixon felt so threatening that he was motivated to steal them back?
I don't think I understand which documents.
What was what motivated the break-in? What were the documents that he was trying to get back?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think while Nixon's role in the cover-up is pretty well documented, first by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, which we had the pleasure of being on a panel with Carl last night at the museum. And while the cover-up, I think, is much better documented, the break-in itself remains a thing kind of shrouded in some degree of mystery. To this date, we still really don't have definitive answers of, who ordered the break-in. We assume it might have been John Mitchell, acting with the approval, perhaps, of Richard Nixon. We don't exactly know what they were looking for, what they were doing there. We assume it was to gather some type of political intelligence. There was a prior break-in at Ellsberg Psychiatrist in Beverly Hills. There were some documents that showed up at a photo lab in Miami that the burglars had taken on a prior occasion with DNC headquarters stationery and some of the pictures. And the agent who was developing the film reported that to officials. But still to this day, there are 70, 100 hours of tapes that aren't released. There are many other records that are either classified, sealed by a court, restricted for some reason or another. So I think we still don't have all the answers, especially about the break-in part, even 40 years later.
Briefly, let me add, you mentioned Beverly Gage and doing a biography of J. Edgar Hoover, so needed. But there was a culture of wiretapping and bugging. Look at all the things the FBI was doing. Here's the Titan J. Edgar Hoover, powerful. Man, if FBI's doing all this stuff, Nixon's people thought, oh.
He did it to Martin Luther King?
Yeah, that's just part of the culture. And even there's one instance where Nixon finds out that LBJ had probably bugged an airplane, right?
And Humphrey.
And Humphrey, and he was proud of them. Nixon saying, you see, that LBJ was part of the, he was trying to bug me. He didn't mind it because he thought that's the way that tough hardball politics was played in that era.
Well, he probably wore it as a badge of pride. The way I have many friends and colleagues in Washington, their proudest moment was being on Nixon's enemies list.
Yes.
Yes.
In fact, I have many colleagues who were really furious that they were not on Nixon's enemies list. Why wasn't I important enough to be on Nixon's enemies list? Yeah.
Given Nixon's cynicism, such as you mentioned, favoring affirmative action, but he was the same person who mounted the Southern strategy, racist to the core. His hypocrisy, when you say he thought it was okay to talk in crude language, but he denounced Truman for using the word hell. What redeeming feature of Nixon is genuine, would you say, and what was all put on for him that he thought he had to behave that way in order to get to a certain goal?
It's an excellent question. He's deeply paradoxical. When Luke used the word square, there are moments, here's a guy using all this bigotry, and we just said it. You should hear him on people from India and the brown-skinned people of the world. It's just so awful, but then he can be very Puritan and puritanical about other things. Like there's one in the book when, like, girls don't swear, do they? Oh my God, no. A good girl will never use a curse word. And, kind of old-fashioned thinking that creeps in there too. So it makes him a bit of a conundrum as a human being. He's a very hard person to put on a couch, except to tell you is a cavernous narcissism.
And maybe it is, going back to the phrase diabolical pragmatist, because to a certain degree, as historians, we have to leave some of this to the psychologists and the psychiatrists, I think, what's really going on. It's a little uncomfortable getting in the head of Richard Nixon sometimes and try to explain why he did what he did. But I think this also suggests someone who was inferior at times and who, you see in the tapes constantly, he needed to be kind of pumped up by his advisors. He needed to be, after a long speech, if 25 of his political friends called him to congratulate him on the best, not just a great speech, but the best speech he'd ever given, and if the 26th person says, "Oh, why didn't Bill Rogers call? What's wrong with him?" He didn't just need the constant support system of those around him. He needed it consistently, constantly, and by everyone he knew. So there clearly was some kind of inferiority going on there too.
And that's trademark narcissism. I mean, it's an overused word today, but a clinical narcissism is people, one insulting comment directed, you can melt you down. So as Luke's suggesting, he could have 50 people praising him. One little jab from somebody could set him off in a dark, deep funk. Hence, all the advisors, there's nobody in our book that stands up to him. Everybody's kissing his ring. Yes, Mr. Ball. Yes, whatever you say. Yes, you're right. Because they're the fear if they dare to challenge him.
That comes through in the play Frost-Nixon, too, that dimension of his personality, yes.
I thought I read just recently that in the tapes, President Nixon actually asks Haldeman to destroy the tapes, and that he does so twice. If that is the case, then why didn't Haldeman destroy them?
Yeah, I think one time, I think the best way to answer your question is, one time I talked to one of Nixon's longtime speechwriter, Ray Price, and he said, of those of us who spent any amount of regular time with Nixon, John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, Henry Kissinger, Ray Price, and just a few others were the ones, they called it the Berlin Wall, because they all have these German-sounding names, and they really were a wall kind of around Nixon's office, controlling access in and out. What Ray Price said to me was, and Ray's still alive up in New York, he said that all of us who spent time with Nixon needed to have a filter. And we had to have a filter on what Nixon said. We had to have a filter on the orders we were given. And he said, some of us had better filters than others.
You mean an internalized filter?
A filter of, if he says something like, let's firebomb the Brookings Institution, let's blow the safe, that you had to know, we really shouldn't be doing that. Another good example is that on the election night 72, it's one of the only times you have conversations at like 3 in the morning, and Nixon calls down to order eggs, a congratulations meal of I think eggs and bacon, and no one's around to take his order, and he's upset. He hangs up the phone, and Haldeman says, here's your telegram that's been drafted by Ray Price to say to McGovern, good luck. I look forward to working with you over the course of the next 4 years. Nixon had just won in a landslide re-election. And Nixon says, don't even send it. Don't send anything at all. I don't know him any message at all. And Haldeman knew better, and he sent the message the next morning. And Nixon asked about it later. Did you ever send that message? Yeah, we did. He's like, it's just as well.
Yeah, by the late Nixon presidency in foreign affairs, Kissinger's just disregarding Nixon. He's working with Brent Scowcroft and Al Haig, and they'd wait hours to even tell the president what was going on. So you're really watching the shrinking of his presidency in the end, where he's not even in charge of foreign affairs.
Fascinating.
Point. Are you saying that in this instance, in the order to destroy the tapes, Haldeman was the filter and he did not act on it for his own volition? I'm trying to figure out how that fits in.
Haldeman had to take orders, and of course, Haldeman was only chief of staff until April 30th. So it's 1973. So things really the really bad period was when Al Haig took over and became chief of staff, and Haig always advised Nixon to burn the tapes too. But obviously, Nixon didn't really want them to do that. Otherwise, the tapes would have been burned.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I think the question I would have wanted to have asked Nixon would concern the missing 18 minutes and Rosemary Woods.
Good point.
And I'm wondering, do historians have
Luke is
any...
going to reenact.
Yeah.
He's going to do his best Rosemary Woods imitation.
I wish I could say it's in the book.
No, but do historians have any theories at this point on the subject matter or anything to do with it?
There have been plenty, and the archives has invested more resources in reconstructing this, from the audio to Haldeman's notes. It's sort of CSI techniques that have been done over the years to try to find anything to hold on to. Of course, we make our best guess also in the book.
Which is what?
What we do is, of course, there's no transcript to feature. We don't leave 5 blank pages for the 18 minutes or anything. But what we do put in the book, and it's June 20th, 1972, in the book for those who are looking for it, what Nixon says is, now back in connection with wiretapping. And if you look at the part that we have available and the part that we don't have available, of what we have available, there's no conversation about wiretapping. So this is the first book that I'm aware of.
So why would he be saying wiretapping, meaning they erased that 18 and a half, but then later out of nowhere he's talking about wiretapping, which leads one to conclude that the 18 and a half minutes
Was at least part of it.
Was at least part
And he
about
goes on to say,
wiretap.
Bob, why do you think we have all of our offices swept regularly for bugs? They do it to us, we do it to them. It's a double standard that we're getting called out for this.
Great.
You mentioned the multitude of Nixon's foreign relations and how he says that he's an expert. But my question is how did Chairman Mao react to this, and how did other foreign diplomats react to these? Were they supporting him still, or did they look down upon him once these tapes were released?
Well, of course, we're really curious, what do the Chinese think about this book? Because, of course, we're lucky to have the archives. The Chinese archives, Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives is periodically open, closed. They don't have nearly the degree of transparency that we do. So we're curious to find out what the reaction is. As best as we know from Chairman Mao's writing and what has appeared in state-controlled media in China, is that Chairman Mao was also asked, you've said that the United States is the arch enemy during the Cold War. How could you, Chairman Mao, make friends with our enemies? The same way that Nixon was being asked, how could you, the lifelong anti-communist, have a change of heart with the Chinese? And Mao also, I think, the Cultural Revolution had not gone very well beginning in 1966, caused a lot of domestic turmoil in China. And I think Mao also, like Nixon later in life, might have been a diabolical pragmatist.
And also, Zhou Enlai I think, saw the virtues of the opening and pushed Mao.
And was much more involved, because both were falling into ill health, too.
Let me just add, Nixon would do things to give like a bone to China that maybe isn't remembered as much. For example, in the Indo-Pakistani War, there was a horrible war going on between Pakistan and India. Nixon sides with Pakistan because they were an ally of China, while India was being an ally of the Soviet Union. So he was showing China by backing Pakistan, we could also back some of your action in situations like this as an incentive to continue improving U.S.-Chinese relations.
That's it? We're done? I'm a trained observer, and I noticed they took the microphones away. So 50 years as a reporter, I could figure this out. This has been a great session, and thanks again to the archives. All of us, all three of us, and so many others owe so much to the archives as an inestimable resource, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't understand that as well. So again, thanks for joining us. Take seriously David's admonition that you can join the Foundation, and no one ever gets blackballed, not even Richard Nixon. So we're delighted you could join us. There is a book signing outside. These two gentlemen will be there in just a minute. So again, Luke Nichter and Doug Brinkley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.